The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is John Spalding with nexusforchange.org. Today we have cultural considerations for leading teams in collaboration. Our presenters are going to be Herb Stevenson and Suzanne Sterling. And some other people that are in our conference room today are Zachary Glover and Jerry Glover, who we may hear from, but our presenters today are Suzanne and Herb on our topic. I'm going to go ahead and get us started just with our technology. So in GoToWebinar, for those of you that are new, this will be helpful. For those of you that have been here before, this won't take that long. I apologize for getting it. Sometimes we have to get people up to speed. So you guys can raise your hand and put your hand down when you're in audio mode. If you raise your hand right now, I'll say hi to you. Hi, Mark. Thanks for raising your hand. Hi, Lynn. Hi, Valerie. Great. Great. I'm glad that that is working. Hey, Wesley. Thanks for being here. And, okay, good. So, hi, Erin. Hi, Jamie. As we go, if you look on the chat feature on the GoToWebinar control panel, after we get through the presentation, Suzanne and Herb are going to be doing some great dilemmas on their content, and they're going to be asking some questions and things like that. So, in the chat feature, there's a link to the our parallel chat room, and it's tinyurl.com/SteveKatie-webinar. So all you have to do is click the plus button on chat, open that window up, and you'll see the link. Click on that link, and it'll take you to that portion. It'll take you to a separate window. This next slide kind of shows you how to set it up. So you guys can see Herb and Suzanne right now, and you can also see my slides. And so what you do is have them over on one window, open up another browser window, and have that chat room right there so you can kind of see that as a scrolling conversation once we get into that part of the presentation. Hey, Dr. Lynn, I saw you enter in the chat room. Welcome. Good to see you. And if you can't use Chatsy, just use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Send me the questions. Mark, you already sent me one. Like you said, like romper room. So Mark is already having fun today. So yes, that's exactly what it's like. So once again, Herb and Suzanne, thank you so much for being here today. How are you two today?
Doing well, thanks.
Cool.
Me too, John. Thank you.
Great. We're going to get to you guys in just a second. Our promotional and kind of our organizational sponsor for some of these sessions is the International Society for Organizational Development and Change. Membership benefits for that organization are free access to the OD Journal, one of the more widely cited OD journals in the world, access to newsletters, webinars, events, conferences, and other opportunities from all over the globe, special student opportunities that will sharpen your skills, and friendship and support from scholars and practitioners in a collegial environment, looking to strengthen your practice and making sure that we are all connected around issues for organizational development and issues that we care about. So thank you for them for being a promotional sponsor for today's session. I am going to hand it over to Suzanne, so give us just a second while I make Suzanne the presenter. And we will get started. And for those of you just joining us, if you look in the chat feature, there's a link to the chat room that we'll open up in a minute. Any questions, send them in there. So Suzanne, did you get the link to present?
Good.
Okay. So as soon as she gets set up, we'll get going. Rochelle, hello from Florida. I think there are some other people on here from Florida too. And Mark, yes, we are recording, and it will be available on YouTube afterwards, and you'll also get a follow-up link from the session. So we have 16 of you here today. That's great, and hopefully some more will be joining. And it looks like Suzanne is ready to go. So let's get started.
I am. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. My name is Suzanne Sterling. I've got over 25 years of developing and leading teams, both from an employee position and a management position, as well as from a volunteer angle. And that's probably what I'm best known for, is working with volunteers and employees in an NGO setting. I do currently consult in cultural competency, organizational systems change, and nonprofit governance and operations, and have a master's of organizational change from Hawaii Pacific. And a little bit about Herb.
The more entertaining version versus what's written there is I typically introduce myself as biracial, multinational, and semi-sane. I am a consultant. I've been doing it for 35 years. You'll see Native American things behind me. I'm both Native American, Caucasian. And I've been doing cross-cultural work probably the last 15 years because I went to a global orientation. But then, as you'll see, some of the examples we'll talk about is we're pretty cross-culture, is almost within any country right now. And this will have major impacts, especially if you're doing any kind of teamwork. So glad to be here with you today.
Okay, and on to our first polling question. You guys can tell us a little bit about yourselves. John, I'll let you walk through the polling.
And so we are launching the poll. Where are you participating from? United States, Canada, Asia, UK, or Europe, or other? Please enter in the chat, and we will get those in there. So go ahead and make your selections. Wow, you guys are on it today. 82% of you have already voted. So you slackers get 10 seconds, and then we're going to close it and show the results. And, all right, 88% have voted. And let's share those results. So we see 87% are from the United States, 13% are from Canada, and I don't see any other things in the chat room coming through. So,
Great.
Yep.
Thanks, John. And our next polling question.
And that is, what type of team are you currently involved in? Global, domestic, functional, or cross-functional? And if you have any questions on that, you can put it in the chat room. But let's go ahead and get those in. They're coming in. 35% of you have voted. 53% have voted. Give you 25 more seconds. I think you guys will be interested in these results. 10 more seconds. Just close it out. Make sure everyone has enough time. So here we go. We have 31% global, 31% domestic, 13% functional, and 25% cross-functional.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So as you can tell, there's all types of teams we function in on a day-to-day basis. Where I need to take this out of the way. So whether we look at either functional, cross-functional, executive, virtual, project teams, or international and quality teams, we could go on for days with the types of different teams that are out there. As we look at our teams, it functions in a variety of ways. So whether it's team design or purpose or cultural context, everything that those three factors impact our team dynamics and our effectiveness on an ongoing basis. So the cultural influence on teams can be from an individual or collective perspective. So how do we recognize team performance? Do we recognize individuals on the team or the team productivity based on the contributions of each individual? Is it universal or particular? Do all teams organize and perform in the same way, or are there certain considerations for certain teams? And do all members have the same status? Is it an achievement-based or an ascription-based? Are we looking at a position, or are we looking at, for example, First Nations or Indigenous leaders? There are a number of common problems and issues with teams, and it could go from anywhere from team zones and schedules to competing subcultures. And you can take a look at the different types of problems and issues. When we get to multicultural team performance, all of the challenges are intensified when our team is made up of culturally diverse participants. And as the team increases its cultural intelligence, we can also see in increasing levels of innovation and performance. Okay, and we use a number of different models to help us understand the team, how it functions, do our assessments, and figure out how to improve the effectiveness across the board. And Herb, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So part of the issue for us is when we're dealing with if you go back to the three things, team purpose, team design, and team culture, most of you are aware that there's a tremendous amount of literature on design and on purpose. Less literature or it's just starting to evolve around cultural forces. And we're using two different types of, or multiple types of cultural lenses because it helps us make meaning that way. So in this case, cultural forces as a definition are powerful because they operate outside of our awareness. It's the water we swim in, so to speak. So we need to understand them not only because of their power, but also because they help explain many of our puzzling and frustrating experiences in social and organizational life. So go to the next slide. So here's the issue, or what I like to use about as a true Shine's definition. It's about time-tested survival. Corporate culture evolves from a time-tested ways of basic survival, growth, adaptation to an ever-changing and challenging environment. So many of you may have heard of, just a second, that's fine, you can leave it there, may have heard of the unwritten rules of the organization. That is usually what we're talking about, culture. And if you've ever been in a situation where how culture can be used against you or for you is if somebody doesn't tell you about the unwritten rules of how to get along within the organization or how to get support, you feel like you're a duck out of water, and oftentimes that's the person who ends up leaving or they get ostracized. So culture can have a very, very powerful impact on the individual, but also can have it on the team because unless we have a team identity around survival, growth, and adaptation, what ends up happening is we clash. Okay? Next slide. So when we look at Shine's categories of culture, he looks at macro cultures like nations, religions, ethnic groups, and cultural professional groups. And I'll talk about some of that in an example in a little bit. I'm going to step out on a limb with one of my examples and bring religion into it because I think that's what we're having cross-cultural clashes right now throughout the world, and especially we're beginning to have that in the U.S. Organizational cultures are different by sector, so whether private, public, NGOs, government, they create their own unique type of culture. People have an understanding of what the purpose is of the organization, why they joined it. And I'll give you an example. I did a lot of work with the DIA, which is Defense Intelligence Agency. I teasingly called them the shadow of the CIA. It's probably true. But their culture was totally different than other organizations that I've worked with in government, and it was because they were around a very specific purpose, and they were highly patriotic individuals, and so dealing with them cross-culturally because they were spread out all over the world became a challenge, and that would be where organizational cultures make a difference. Subcultures, this is where you can get into the intricacies of what makes you crazy within an organization, especially your team, so you'll have occupational groups within companies, and you can have microcultures. And if it sounds like it's complex, it can be. The issue for you is, what do you want to focus on? Of the tools or methodologies that you could learn, what application you want to focus on, which narrows it down to one way to highlight making meaning and create improvement. Okay? Next slide. So we're going to focus on just the three generic subcultures, and I'll give you some examples of how this works. Shine decided it within any organization there's three subcultures. He calls it the CEO or C-suite, engineers, and operators. I would go a step further, and what I've done lately is I call it executive and engineers. I call it management systems because they're managing systems. So it might be engineers. They're technically competent, but they're also managing systems in a more progressive language. And then operators are the people who do the work. And they each are separate in how they language and do what they do. So they have embedded assumptions that are different of how to succeed, survive, and they generally do not trust each other, let alone use the same process to make meaning. I can give you just a brief example. I was working with an executive group out of Dubai, and the top executives were getting mixed messages. The attorneys and accountants were saying, settle a lawsuit, and the people in the field were saying, they're bluffing, we did the work, don't settle. And the executive does not trust the operators to be telling the truth, so he listened to the attorney, even though, in fact, they gave up money that they didn't need to lose. And that was one of those situations of how the cultures, if they really don't slow down to deal with the facts, can be problematic. Next slide.
Okay, Don, I'm back to you with the polling question. So which of the subcultures do you guys find most challenging?
And so go ahead and enter in there, C-suite, engineer, or operator. 56 of you have 56% has voted. We'll give you about 15 more seconds to go ahead and get those votes in. What are the three subcultures? Which of the three do you find most challenging? Ten more seconds to get your votes in, guys. 67% of you have voted. All right, and let's check the results. As you guys can see, 50% say the C-suite, 17% say engineer, and 33% say operator.
Thanks, everybody. And Herb, we'll go back to your next case.
Just a side comment, I would be intrigued to go deeper as to why each of you selected C-suite, engineer, or operator.
Yeah, and I think what we can do, Herb, is they can put that in the chat and we can bring that up later as part of the reflection discussion.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. You would. I have my own assumptions, but I would be curious to hear what they are. This is a live example. It's about 15 years old. I did some work for NASA. I was called in by an executive director. There was two issues that he saw. I'm going to highlight two things in this one. One is the shine subcultures, and then I'm going to overlay that with cross-cultural from a national and ethnic point of view. And you begin to realize the difficulty and that can happen, but if you hold your lens, the impact of it is you can have a massive impact on the not only the success of the project, but you can also have an impact on somebody's career. So with that said, the executive director called in for one of the NASA centers, and his comment was his team's unable to sustain dialogue. And the second thing he had was that there was a massive conflict by all levels with the project team. Now, if you have a pencil and paper, you can write some of this down to help you. So the level of details is I'm dealing with the executive from the C-suite, a senior leadership individual from who's the division lead, so he's like of 3 divisions of this very large billion-dollar NASA center. Then there's a mid-level management who's the project lead, and there's the operators, which were actually researchers and technicians doing research for NASA on rocket engines and various other types of things. That was just the basics of what I was doing and meet with them. But one of the things I wanted to find out was what was creating some of the issues. And I started with the first one, which is the dialogue, and had conversations with the executive about his conflict style. And we did an assessment which basically said that it came out that he was a highly competitive individual. He wanted to win, and that has a lot of cultural implications, but I'll just leave it at that because I want to stay with Shine's stuff. The number 2 tended to be more passive. The number 3, which is a project leader, tended to be conflicted. He would start to get passionate, then he'd excuse himself, go out, calm down, he'd come back into the room. And the operators and technicians said that, you know, they didn't know what to do because either they were focusing on the emotions or they were focusing on just when the conversation gets good, he leaves the room. And at first I struggled with what is going on here. This is one of the craziest things I've ever seen, and I'm sure many of you, if you're attending this, have come across that. And so what I ended up addressing was that I did a cultural analysis. And the executive was Caucasian, and he was brought up that highly competitive, individualistic approach is how you do things. The division lead was an upper-class Puerto Rican where everybody is supposed to be polite, have conversations, collaborate. Beneath him, though, was a working-class Puerto Rican who had gone to school and become an engineer, and he was very passionate, very expressive. It's his natural inclination. And then the operators, which were research and technicians, there were two Caucasians, and the first sign of any aggressive behavior, they looked like deer in the headlights, and then there was two African Americans. Just when the passions got up, they got fully engaged. And you suddenly begin to realize what each of them need cross-culturally about how just, if we don't focus on anything but how to deal with conflict, and is it expressive or non-expressive, just using those two dynamics, the result came is we began to have a realization of what was going on. So by unravel that, one way to support it is the executive realized that if he treated everything as competition, and he's the top executive, who in their right mind is going to say anything? He's going to beat them down, and as a result, they're not going to be able to do anything, so they just let it go. He did change his style and understand it cross-culturally. Conflict style, several of the people wanted to be expressive, but they wanted to also be heard. And the result is we began to change his behavior, which was the first step. The second step is to go through with each person with their core assumptions. So the division lead felt embarrassed by the working class Puerto Rican because they're both Puerto Ricans, and he thought he was misrepresenting. When we examined the core values between the two of them about passion expression versus not, they suddenly had a complete reawareness of they're both their mother country versus what they had before. And then when we got to the Caucasians, they realized, okay, he's just being passionate, and his style, the project leader style, would be toned down when he's dealing with the two Caucasians because they struggled with the passion. The two African Americans, he would take them off in a separate room, and they would holler, scream, and do whatever they needed to do, but they would walk out friends and got things done. Interesting part is, this was 15 years ago, the project leader he was being terminated because everybody saw him as the problem. 15 years later, he's thriving in the organization. He understands cross-culturally how to approach things. And it ended up being a complete success where if I hadn't applied the national cultural lens to this, he'd have probably been terminated. So if you have any thoughts or questions on that, please do. But I think I've answered most of those questions.
How do you see the three subcultures for Shine fitting into those?
Well, Shine Subcultures is the executive was the director was the top. The project leader and the project and division leader were actually what I call management systems, and then the lower level for NASA, because NASA is the most concentrated level of PhDs in any organization. They're researchers and technicians, but they're still the operator. They do the work. So when I looked at it from those three perspectives, the executive should be giving guidance. The management systems should be providing instructions on how to get the work done and where to focus attention, how to use the resources. And the last one, the operators or technicians, just simply want to know, what the hell do you want me to do? And that was getting all over the place because of this cultural clash of how to address issues.
And so how long was it from the time that you started to see this and talk to the executives and those involved until you started to see an actual change on the team performance?
The interesting thing about it was fairly quick. The first 3 months was frustrating for everybody because, I was expecting each time I would go into the room to be tarred and feathered and sent off out the door because the frustration level was so high. But once we got the assessments and began the conversation, first from the executive level, understanding his style cross-culturally of focusing on the individual versus on the team, that was the first thing that started shifting, and he acknowledged the meetings got better. People started talking. But the second one was the longer term issue. That took about, it was relatively quick actually. At about 6 months, we had made enough progress, and everybody realized it wasn't a blaming or somebody was wrong, it was just a misunderstanding. Everybody was working very smoothly. All the conflicts, being the most troubled project on the center, went away. People said, I don't know what you guys did, but you know, they're happy, they're smiling, they're working together. So at about 6 months I was out, follow-up 6 months. It was still working, and about a year ago, which would have been about 14 years now, the project leader sent me a very positive thing about all he had learned and the fact that he was still around and he was doing quite well. So it was long-term success. I don't have not all of them are long-term successes, but that one was.
Absolutely. Congratulations. It sounds like a great thing to be involved with. As you've heard from Herb's example, national culture does absolutely lay over organizational cultures. And there were some examples from both Fons Trompenaars and Charles Hampden Turner's model, the 7 dimensions of culture. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the model. We also look at Kurt Hofstein and his dimensions of national culture. So if we know those well enough to be able to apply to any environment, it gives us increased tools in our toolbox and how they interact. And Herb, I'm going to turn it back to you for our next case.
I was called into the Cleveland Metro Parks. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Cleveland, Ohio, but it has an emerald ring is what they call this park. We were blessed with, John Rockefeller was actually originally from Cleveland, and he bought this land that surrounded the city and gave it to him and said, this is your park. If you take care of it, the city will grow out to it, which interesting it did. The city of Cleveland grew out to this park. It encases a large amount of the Lake Erie, so there's amount of beaches are rather phenomenal, quite well taken care of. The interesting thing that came out of it was the park rangers asked me to come in because they've had an increase of contested and difficult encounters with what they call custard, which is basically people who participate in all the park's activities. One of the things I first asked them was, I says, are most of these, who are these most with? Are they, you know, just average everyday Clevelanders, or are these immigrants? Are these family get-togethers of immigrants and they're speaking in their mother tongue? And they were like stunned that I would ask that question. And part of it was it's because I like to go to the beach, and I enjoy walking around and listening to the various languages that are being spoke. There's something that I've always been attracted to. So at first I was asked to do inclusion training, but what I ended up doing I used Mitchell Hammer's. It's called an intercultural conflict assessment, which was just using Trompenaars and Hofstein's, 2 of their models, or 2 of their polarities. Primary one is type of communication, is it direct or indirect, and is it passionate or not passionate. That's the only 2 dynamics they're using. You begin to get a style, and then they placed it around all the various countries in the world. The result of it and also for the makeup for you is, the Metro Parks was like 99% white males, 1% females, and people of color. And that was one of the things I pointed out to them that they might want to consider. But when we went through this, I highlighted the cross-cultural approach to conflict and how people are different. And I used my example. The result of it when we began to realize, I said, first of all, get relational and talk to people about what are they doing, and we see that you have a large gathering, where you're from, get to know the people a little bit, understand what's happening, and then explain to them, we want to really support you, and we're very happy you're using the Metro Parks. And what we also want you to be is in consideration of not only just taking care of yourself, but also the rest of the people around the park, being respectful. When it was put those terms, all of the difficult processes or encounters went down. In other words, the difficult encounter is one that ended up having to be written up because it may have gotten very assertive or aggressive, or they may have had to call in other officers as backup to show an active force. And again, these are all actions that are cross-culturally dependent. In the U.S., you bring in more force. In other places, you walk in and talk to them. And the impact was, in this case, is because we're looking at it from a different point of view, is it was a cross-cultural overlay to the city of Cleveland metro parks. And that's why I'm saying I don't know of any corporation that doesn't have cross-cultural issues at this point. Questions, Suzanne?
You've given us some of the pieces that helped you identify those cultural influences. What approach did you use to, you talked a little bit about team effectiveness. Was there anything that you did specifically with the team as far as training or professional development?
We were doing a cross-cultural training at that point. They called it diversity and inclusion, which, by the way, that's part of my master's degree, was diversity, inclusion, and cross-cultural training. Part of it is helping them just understand and then get into small groups of actually applying an example from each of the nationalities that they had encountered and had a problem, and then ask themselves, if I had approached this differently, what would that look like? That brought it home because now they, in small groups, had an experience about it, but the second part of it was then they shared that with each other, and the afternoon, which the director who had hired me to come do this, he said, I didn't see anything but people nodding heads, yes, I understand, or I've seen that. And so we know it went in, and then the result of the incidents going down wasn't that they're not writing the reports, it's literally that the incidents went down. There was more smiling rangers, and which is always an interesting thing. When we overcome cross-cultural problems, people tend to smile more.
Absolutely.
And Herb, there are a couple comments in the chat room I just wanted to bring up. Dr. Lynn said, and this was back on the Shines work, she said it was a good reminder of Shines work. She studied with him during her PhD, and she said Beckert always said build a team around a task and not just to have a team. But her question was, she said that she links those differences from this case to how tasks are accomplished rather than just style or culture as a variable by itself. She said it makes the emotional issues easier to frame and use as benefits for the tasks. Well, how would you reply to that statement from her?
If she can bear with us, I'm going to have an example of that exact issue.
Okay. She'll bear with us, and she'll come back in.
Yeah. Short, about 10 minutes, I'm going to cover one where I brought in 38 healthcare agencies for a very specific problem, and cross-culturally, from an organizational point of view, pain, agony, and distress, but from a point of view of we focused on the task to take the emotions out. So I have an example of that for you. So
cool.
Bear with me and I'll get to you. Second question?
Yep, it's from Kimberly. Do the presenters integrate a cross-cultural lens to all of their consulting assignments, or do they look for signs that a cross-cultural issue may be negatively impacting the team performance?
I have my, I want to hear you.
It was fun listening to watching your facial expressions on the video as I was reading the question.
Well, it's interesting. For me, I'm working with a group right now very much like the example that Herb is going to share. And because I've now been programmed to watch for those cultural triggers or that language and how people interact with each other, I find it difficult not to see culture first and go from there. And there's a lot of conflict. I'm dealing with a healthcare integration group, and they're not ready to hear the culture piece, but everything I do when I work with them comes from that basis, and they've moved so far ahead in the last 6 months where they've been working on this project for anywhere from 12 to 18 months and adding different group members. There's about 15 different groups involved, and they got nowhere, which is why they had to bring somebody in. And I feel fortunate to be able to share my skills with them and watch them through this process. It's been very difficult so far. Herb?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. Once you learn the cross-cultural lens, it becomes in the background all the time. So do I go through a process of saying is, what am I not seeing? Because usually that's there might be a cross-cultural issue here. So frequently when I'm frustrated, that's what I'll ask myself, what am I not seeing? What assumptions am I having that are getting in the way so that I can look at this differently? And so I may pull something out. And the way I do things is I have to use hand to eye movement. So I actually will draw a chart saying is this is what I'm seeing, and is this a type of polarity that's happening? But one of the things that I found out is once you get the understanding of cross-cultural dynamics learned, it's just with you, and it surfaces to the front when it's appropriate, and it goes back. So in other words, you're doing a diagnosis, but it's on a more of an informal basis, unless you know you've been called in because of a culture clash. And the best example of that would be is the number of mergers and acquisitions occurring. I guarantee you there's a culture clash in all of those, and there's tons of case stories with the organizations that didn't integrate themselves. In fact, I can talk. That's what I'm going to talk about next.
And it's interesting, when I did my training on the Tompkins model, the lady that did our training, name was Barbara, and she explained those what am I not seeing moments. She calls them grr moments. Like, it's like, oh, what am I missing here? And she said, when you feel that, ask yourself, what is the cultural piece? And she said 9 times out of 10, it is a culture clash. So, John, anybody else as far as comments from our chat room?
Just one last one from Erin. She wants to know, do you also challenge the you also challenge them to assess how they handled intracultural conflict and discuss better techniques in that scenario with them?
From my perspective, they're not ready for that. I have a very dominant, I have a co-chair situation. One is very dominant and very much wants to control everybody and everything. The co-chair is, the other co-chair is a little bit more passive, passive-aggressive actually. And so they're not ready. When I start talking culture, they shut down because they don't see themselves as being in a cultural environment. And so everything I do has to be reframed as far as effectiveness and reaching goals and deadlines, and then they'll start to move forward, although I'm embedding everything that I do from a cultural lens. Herb, how about you?
I have an example I'm right in the middle of. I have a major, one of the top Japanese companies who owns an American company. And the leadership in the U.S. company they purchased is now 50-50 Japanese and American, and we have a real cross-cultural dynamic. So when I came into it right up front, I said, how are we handling the sensitivities and insensitivities? And immediately got a ton of information of saying is that we have that all problem all the time, and we're managing ourselves. And I said, well, why not reconcile it? Why not actually go through and evaluate what the differences are so that we can do it? So I'm doing that in the process right now. And so if you're doing any global work whatsoever, and especially if they've done an acquisition from another country, put that lens on very heavily, because that will be the source of a lot of your conflicts and frustrations. Okay?
Just to wrap up our Metro Park Rangers, how long was it before you started to see changes with the team?
I was only in for a very short, there was consultants are, your length of your contract is managed by the budget. So I had a very small budget, and I did what I could for them, and I asked them, I said, can we do follow-up? And so we did. They saw an immediate response, because we think we did this in the spring, and then their busy season's the summer. And the follow-up at that point was that it was having a big impact, and in fact, they were surprised. The guys were still talking about it well, I ran into an Asian group, and this is what happened. Could I have done it different? So it stuck. Final results, I don't know. I just know it was improved, and I wasn't called back. So.
Excellent. Thank you. John, just the last thing.
When you're a consultant, you always tell everybody if you're not called back, you were successful.
John, any last questions and comments or discussions from the chat?
Nope, we're all set for this round.
Okay, on to our next case. And Herb, this is yours.
I call it the Irish Mafia. This is being sarcastic or satirical. They're actually, it was an Irish company in the oil and gas industry. And they, this was prior to being bought by a Canadian company. But it was a virtual team. They were, the team was located in 12 countries. The majority are from the UK, so probably mostly Irish, a few Scotsmen, and the rest were Brits. And the minority were from the Middle East and South Africa. And to give you the breakdown of what was going on is primary communication by all these were by telephone, rarely ever saw anybody. And one of the things that I initiated was a transition to video conferencing to get face value, because that makes a difference. And then the other one is to get into a training process with them that was 3 times over 12 months for 5 days, so they actually could work together. And the company supported this. Now, what was major importance here is, first, that the people from the UK understand that even though they fight amongst themselves, they're with cultural differences, as a whole they were bonding together around conflict styles. So they were more in your face, very aggressive types of conflict style, whereas a lot of the people from the Middle East on this mid-major team, and also from South Africa, were not. And so again, I did a cross-cultural conflict assessment with them to just highlight it, and to make it live, I had them stand up in the room and divide it into the 4 quadrants. And the majority of those from the UK were in the assertive, aggressive, direct communications, more stoic approach, whereas South African and Middle Eastern were not. And in one case, the Middle Eastern ended up not being there that day, but South African was, and I knew his history. He was actually he was a very prominent tribal person, considered a tribal leader and a spiritualist. And I leaned into it by saying, so all of you guys over here are pretty feisty, and you know, you're Irish, Scots, Brits, you're tough guys, and they're all getting puffy and saying, yeah, that's, you know. And I said, how many of you think this guy's a wimp? And they looked at me, and there was a couple of smirks. And I said, so based on our assessment, what did we learn? And culturally, the South African, if he is to raise his voice and get very assertive, he's disrespecting you and your family. Actually, the term that Akin would use is your spirit. Totally shocked them. And one of the individuals looked at me and he says, you just completely reoriented me. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, when I talk to him now, I'm going to engage him in a completely different way. And I said, why? And he says, because now I understand he's not a wimp. He's actually stronger than I am, because some of the things I've done and said to him, I would have beat somebody up for that. And it changed the whole group. The team after that started bonding, and the result of it is the cross-cultural was the lens that brought them together, and they've now been merged into another company, which I think over half the team's gone, and I have some contact with them, but not a lot. But for that period, we were highly successful in bringing them together.
That's great, Herb. Well, I think probably the only question that you haven't touched on yet is how long did you work with the team before you started to see the changes and the shift, like on a performance and effectiveness piece?
By the second 6 months because I was doing coaching in between. We started seeing differences. So what ended up happening is I started seeing it 6 months because they started seeing it, understanding the impact of what happened in the coaching, and they were asking questions like, oh, how do I deal with some of these things? So it's 6 months they started coming together. Now the interesting part happens, as many of you, if you're in consulting, will know this. When you start off a consulting process, at first if you do assessments or you give them more information than they want to know about themselves, they close down and look like they have deer in the headlights. They don't want to talk a whole lot, and if you put them into small teams, they struggle because they still know each other. They're located elsewhere. By the second time, they were actually engaging, and then we got to the third time, how they changed and how they moved into dialogue and how they became problem solvers as a team versus just reporting, because most of their meetings virtually were just report outs. This now became it was okay to ask questions, also to offer suggestions. So by the end of the year, the team was actually running quite smoothly, and that was 2 years ago. And since then, they went through the merger or acquisition. Okay.
Thank you. And John, any comments or questions from the discussion room?
Apparently not.
That is right, Herb. There are not. So, and I was just putting in the chat room if anyone has any comments or questions to get them in there. So let's do that now. And, give them a couple seconds, and we'll come back.
Well, and we can also move on to the next page.
Yeah, let's go to the next case. I want to answer Dr. Lynn's.
Perfect.
So sometimes when you have a cross-cultural issue, it's cross-organizational, and consultants sometimes don't understand that if you see a pile of manure, you don't want to necessarily step in it. And I'm being graphic for a purpose, because you know it's going to be a mess, so why do it? So in this situation, what happened was there was an impending shortage of qualified teachers to create what in Ohio they now call nurse practitioners, which were registered nurses, all sorts of names, so they brought into this one need or process. So without qualified teachers, 20% shortage within 12 months, they anticipated a shortage of actually qualified nurse practitioners of 20 to 30% in 18 months. They didn't take a genius because they 15 years had a similar problem, and it spiked the cost of nurses because they got into a competitive bid without actually looking at what was going on, and they raised the prices of their costs. So not wanting to do that, I used that as the mechanism, and I had 38 organizations. Now we're talking mega organizations like the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Metro Health, the People's Hospital here in Cleveland. All of these are multi-billion-dollar organizations, and if you know much about the Cleveland Clinic, they have hospitals in Scottsdale, Dubai, Tokyo, I believe, Abu Dhabi. Their goal is to be a global hospital. They don't need anybody. That's what they basically will tell you. And University Hospitals has one of the top medical schools, and you get the picture. And then you have all of these supply chain people. You have the medical schools, and so I just went for the task. And by doing that and avoiding the internal what we would call culture, but in this case they would call politics in a very negative sense, or I would call bad behavior, what we focused on is with this task in mind and only that task in mind, what's working, what's not working, and what are some action items that we can actually work through. And we went through a 3-day process of that, and by the time we were finished, they were stunned because not only did they get to know each other, but they realized that they could come around common solutions to problems that they would not have come around. And so the cultural dynamic, or the big pile in the middle, I just simply avoided it. It was so successful because this was funded by a foundation. They came and asked me, said, what'd you do? Because these people actually never accomplished anything. And I said, I focus on the task. If you have a common purpose. And that's all you focus on, and don't allow, because I set some rules of engagement up, is we'll treat each other with respect and things of that nature. The result of it was we got past that to move forward. Now, did they go back to some of their prior behaviors? I'm sure they did. But the one thing that they have done is they addressed this and actually reduced or mitigated the potential damage, and they did not have a dramatic increase in costs or a shortage of nurses. So did we get questions? Dr. Lynn, did that answer what you were asking?
And hopefully she will check in. We do have one question from Kimberly. How do you help a client organization address cross-cultural conflict when the team is resistant to acknowledging that might be negatively affecting their performance?
You want to answer, Suzanne? I'll follow you.
Thank you.
Or do you want me to go?
I talk about behaviors and differences, and I challenge with questions. When I bring up the word culture, they shut down on me, because I think there's a lot of people out there that still don't understand that piece. And until they're ready, there's a few in the room that I started to talk on to the side about this being a cultural issue, and that not being a bad thing, but it's a good thing because now we can move forward and identify it using some tools. So I'm still working through the process with the group I've got on the go now. My big thing at the end of the day is how can I move them forward to meet their targets, and I'm there to support and help and facilitate that, and what they need is my primary concern, and I always apply a cultural lens.
Okay.
And just so you know, Dr. Lynn said good answer. She too uses the rules of engagement. It's a very effective approach until the group can own their own process.
Excellent. Super. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Part of the problem we have when we use words like culture, a lot of organizations, there's biases out there. I think a lot of it came out of the business schools. They may not like that I said that, but that seems to be the case. The culture's woo-woo. And the issue, so what I try to do is put it in the language that they use. So if they use phrases like their team dynamics or dysfunctionality, I might go the oblique way, which is ask them if they'll read a book on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I may ask them to, and it's interesting, a lot of times they'll do that, and that may mean if I'm dealing with the team leader gets I go for that buy-in first. And by using the reading, I point out to them, I says, the fastest way for us to all advance is if we read a book. Strange as it may sound, it all gives us a common language, a common set of concepts to talk about, and maybe explore something we haven't seen. And the result of that is then when it comes time to say, and which one of these is causing us our grief, I usually break through the ice, and they begin to look at it. Now, and I still may not call it culture, I may just call it team dynamics.
Absolutely.
But we are highly sensitized in our organizations when we start moving into the behavioral or the humanistic sides. And that usually comes down to they're afraid to be embarrassed. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are a couple other ones. Jill Shakespeare, this question is for you, Suzanne. Can you give her some of the examples of the kinds of questions that you ask? And that's back to the previous answer about addressing cultural conflict with teams that are resistant.
I think with this team, because they struggled for 12 to 18 months before bringing somebody on board, there's a lot of dynamics that have not been shared with me. There's a lot of side conversations. So one of the things I do is I ask the tough questions. And because, I'm sort of the new kid on the block with a lot of the group, have been working with these guys since June, I can ask the questions. I'm non-threatening. I'm not from a common funding body. I'm not demanding that the changes be made and these different organizations integrate under one body. So I'm sort of that neutral party. So it's safer for me to ask the questions. I've encouraged the group, if they've got questions that they would like me to ask, let me know, and I'll certainly bring them up and provide some context without sort of outing the person that wanted to know. And that's working fairly well so far. So these guys probably have another 2.5 years of this process, and it's moving forward, which is a great step. Thank you. Does that answer the question?
We'll find out in a minute.
Excellent.
And while we're doing that, I'll just read the last comment from Dr. Lynn, and I think she says yes, thanks. Dr. Lynn said another slice on this is to make sure that they're focused on the mission and not just the separate tasks as a unifier across cultures. Do you guys have a,
Right.
Yeah, I'm assuming that you all do that and have some comments about that.
To help them, oftentimes will do two things. So if I'm dealing with a team, because that's what our subject is, I look at the vision, mission, and values of the organization, but then I ask them, what's the vision, mission, values of this team? And a lot of times they go, never heard such thing. And I said, well, and if we do that, what ends up happening is then I said, so it has to fold into the larger organization, but we have a very specific task we're supposed to finish. And that oftentimes leads to that process for me. That's how I do it. Hackman, if you want to read books on team effectiveness, I subscribe to a lot of his stuff. He's passed, but his books are still available. I'll leave it at that.
I'm sensitive to the time, and we're quickly running out of time. Moving forward, if you'd like to continue the discussion or learn more with us, we do have a leading teams and collaboration session starting through the Florida Institute of Technology. Everything's completely online, and it starts on Monday, so you can certainly connect with us for more information. You'll also be getting all of the slides, including the slides with some of the notes from Curb's cases. So that's one way to continue the conversation. It is part of our professional certificate in cultural competence for anyone that is interested in doing a certificate with us. And the one textbook that we use is the Transcultural Competence book by Glover and Friedman. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Glover, who's part of our team, and let him tell you what a neat program we've got off the ground in the UK.
Okay, just 1 second, and thank you both for your great webinar. We do have a master's program that we're starting through ICAL, Institute for Cultural and Adaptive Leadership, which of course is also doing the courses at FIT. It is a professional association, and if you're interested in becoming a member, the membership is free. Contact Suzanne or myself, and we'll be glad to give you more information. But we do have a master's program offered in England in a partnership with the Professional Development Foundation. It's validated by Middlesex University, and it's really going to be an academic graduate level program that deals with the issues of culture, adapting, and leadership, and change, of course. And we will have some great online courses, and certainly if you're interested in it further, you can contact Kim Barker, who is the dean of the program, and you'll see the information there for contacting her. But if you have any interest in that or the 4-month certificate that's part of the program, certainly give us a contact. And you can also contact Suzanne or myself. Anyway, thanks both of you for the great seminar, and I'll turn it back over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Jerry. John, any final parting comments from our chat room?
Yes, who's the author that Herb just mentioned?
You know what? We can add some content and send it to the slides, and Herb, I'll let you answer that quickly.
Yeah, it's I can't remember his first name. It's Hackman, Hackman. Usually the book's close by, but we'll include it into the details that goes out, because we're going to send actually with more detail of the case studies that will be the slides that are sent out to everybody.
Any other questions?
I don't see any right yet.
Excellent. So we'll wrap it up. Thank you to everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you in future webinars. John?
Yes.
Great.
Comments?
Yep, and so just as you guys can see on the slide right now, if you guys want to join Suzanne on LinkedIn for a follow-up debrief or just check the invitation for ways to contact her, our next session for Nexus will be a facilitators roundtable with Roland and Jeremy from the International Society for Organizational Development and Change, and there's information that's going to be coming out on that soon. After the end of this session, you'll be asked to do a survey, the Nexus webinar survey. Just give Herb and Suzanne some feedback on their presentation. I thought you guys did great. It was a good mix of audience participation, cases, and relevant contextual information. So thanks to both of you for a great session, and we will see you all next time.
And thanks next for changing, John.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, this concludes our Nexus webinar, and we will see you next time. Thanks for being here. And you guys can,
Bye, everybody.
you guys can hold on and we'll